Hey there guys, it's Metro, and today we're back with another tier list, this time ranking the dungeons on Mythic plus difficulty, mostly in order of my preference, but also along the lines of how accessible, how easy they are, especially to pug. Try to think of it this way: when you're pugging Mythic plus dungeons and you see a group spamming for one of these dungeons, how likely are you to join it? That's basically what this list is, so of course it will be almost entirely based on my opinions, which of course you are welcome to disagree with. So if you want to leave a comment, please do so about how you feel your dungeon tier list would look, what your favorite dungeon is to do Mythic Plus on, and perhaps what your least favorite is as well. So we'll get right into it. Tier 1, number one overall is of course Maw of Souls. Very much the resto druid of the dungeons. Everybody seems to agree that this is the most accessible, the shortest, and the easiest one to do, no matter if you're pugging, doing carry groups, or even doing progress on. There's very little in here that is actually a challenge for any type of group, no matter what you are. And this kind of is a great example of a dungeon that bends the rules that I spoke about on my tier lists. There's almost nothing that you need a grip on, almost nothing that can actually be stunned that would help you stunned, and there's very little actual bosses and trash overall, making it the shortest dungeon by a large margin, and the second and third boss are very simple compared to any other boss in the entire game. It also contains a lot of good loot that a lot of people are looking for, so it's easy to see why Maw of Souls is de facto number 1 on this list. Tier 1, number 2 is Darkheart Thicket. This is easily my favorite dungeon in the entire game, and the main reason it is so is because it reminds me a lot of dungeon design from challenge modes of old. A lot of mobs can be skipped, there's a lot of optional situations you could find yourself in this dungeon, and there's a lot of really great time for utility, time for big pulls, time for small pulls, and I feel like the affixes have a great variance on the actual dungeon itself. On top of that, the dungeons and the trash for the most part are very straightforward. No really annoying or crazy mechanics, nothing that prevents you from playing your class the way you want to play it either. I really love playing a Holy Paladin and a Death Knight in this dungeon because boss damage as a Holy Paladin is really easy to create, and having grips as a Death Knight for the Dryads and battle reses for controlled wipes at the end make this easily my favorite dungeon to do. I could literally sit here and do it all day, every day, and I would never get bored of it. Tier 1, number 3 is Nelth's Lair, and a lot of what I said about Darkheart Thicket rings true here as well. A lot of optional packs you can skip or choose to pull, packs you can decide to pull together to make better usage of uptime on CDs and potions, and a lot of easy boss mechanics that do not force you to play your class in a way that may not be fun for you, but also some interesting tricks and mechanics that you could exploit on bosses, especially the final 2 bosses there. Trash itself in the dungeon is really fun and engaging to me, especially as a Death Knight. Once again, more mobs that can be stunned, gripped, and feared from all our different abilities that work really well to help the group survive and kill it much quicker. Pacing of the dungeon feels very appropriate for Mythic Plus. No matter what type of group you're doing it with, no matter what keystone you're doing it on, I always feel like I know exactly what's going to happen in Nelth's Lair without any confusion based on the affixes. Tier 2, number 1, number 4 overall is Eye of Azshara. If you're interested in skippable trash, this dungeon is the pinnacle of such. It probably contains 6 times more trash than is actually needed, so you're able to pick and choose what type of pulls you want to make and when. However, I don't like this dungeon very much because a lot of the bosses in here are really annoying, featuring mechanics that simply are not fun to do, especially as the tank and healer rules. Primarily, the Hydra boss and the final boss especially come to mind. The Hydra boss is even worse because the birds are all around the boss that people aggro constantly. You don't need them for mob count, and they stun the tank and are simply annoying. And then of course the boss leaves and goes elsewhere and you have to chase him around. And then he throws the poison at you, so when you're tanking the main head while everyone else is attacking the other ones, you're constantly having to move. And really unfun mechanics for me. And same thing on the final boss. Mechanics that force you to stand still and then move and then stand still and then move, and all while avoiding getting knocked back by other mechanics. Not a very well designed set of bosses if you ask me, but the dungeon and layout itself are pretty cool, other than the fact that it's mirroring an open world area, which almost nobody goes to. Tier 2, number 2, Halls of Valor. Easily my favorite dungeon in terms of aesthetics, but unfortunately a lot of pain in the ass mechanics throughout. One good thing about the dungeon as a DK is, once again, there are mobs that refuse to stay in melee range, and this is probably one of the only reasons I actually enjoy running it. There's a lot of things you can do as a Death Knight in here that are very, very useful, including fighting the wolves and the archers that try to jump away. However, the dungeon suffers from a complicated layout, one that seems fun on paper but is really a contrivance once you actually do it. Having to run from side to side, even with the speed buff at the end, is really stupid. And the fact that you have to run through water kind of is like their way of adding some type of, I don't know, even fake difficulty, I guess is the only way to describe it to the run. If you have water walking though, once again as a DK, you could just run through the middle of the water on the side with Fenrir, and that is that solved. So bosses themselves are kind of cool, but the final two bosses just being back to back after no more trash is also a pain, especially if for some reason you make a mistake with mob count, which I've done plenty of times as they continue to change the way you can use the beer cups for skips in this dungeon. Overall, the dungeon is great aesthetically, but physically and mechanically it's got something lacking, especially in a speedrun capacity. It also has some of the most annoying trash in the entire video game, and this gets complicated especially when you have bolstering or teaming and you get into the higher level mythic pluses. Number 6 overall. Number 3, tier 2, the Arcway. I don't particularly enjoy this dungeon at all, not visually or mechanically, but I recognize that some of the gear it has is absolutely absurdly strong. That is really the number one reason it's this high on the list, and it's really not that high at all. The dungeon is incredibly long. I think it's safe to say it's the longest Mythic Plus dungeon, and a lot of the trash can be very, very, very stubborn. Some of it refuses to move, some of it constantly casts, and others are immune to stun. There's a lot of bosses in here, and they're not too difficult, so that's one thing to say for its positives, but in general, there's so much running in between the areas that I really can't say I enjoy it. Even the final boss has you run more, and if there's one thing I hate in Mythic Plus or challenge mode mentality, it's having to travel a lot. Time-wise, you should be saving time when you're doing more damage, executing pulls more efficiently, but certainly not because you're running faster than somebody else. And all the time spent running just really makes me feel like we're in a Karazhan type 5-man that was never meant to be done fast or in Mythic Plus at all. Tier 3, number 1, number 7 overall is Blackrook Hold. This is a dungeon I actually really enjoy when we're not doing Mythic Plus, but when you are, it can be a nightmare, especially with two certain affixes. Bolstering and necrotic are particularly bad in this dungeon, mostly because there's a lot of really trashy, high density mob pulls throughout the entire dungeon. It's really a pain, and all the mobs already kind of interact with each other in a way that make them dangerous. So when you add bolstering or even some of the other affixes to the mix, this place gets exponentially harder than most other dungeons. This dungeon also suffers from a big issue in terms of mob. There's not a single piece of trash that you could skip in a conventional way in this entire dungeon, and you're way over mob count when you finish. So it basically forces you to use some type of invis pot, or maybe now that the rogue ability is returning, this will have more value. But regardless, I really do not like this as a Mythic Plus, mainly because of the fact that you cannot do anything odd or crazy to get any type of advantage other than some very basic and natural progression steps. The bosses in here are also particularly annoying. First boss especially has the mechanic with the ghost that can be avoided if you burst them hard enough at the end, but everybody always uses their CDs on the pull, effectively squandering one of the best boss skips in the game. The final boss also baits you into poor play with his mechanic where he empowers and then you get empowered. Everybody always tries to lust as soon as you get empowered, but in reality you only have about a 15 to 20 second window before he then becomes unattackable. There's a really poor usage of potions and lust, but it baits a lot of poor players into using it then. Tier 3, number 2, Vault of the Wardens. Easily my least favorite dungeon for all reasons, but this one, especially for a 5-man Mythic Plus, is particularly annoying. It has very little trash in it, which means mob count can become a pain, and at the end, oh man, the most annoying trash that I've ever seen in any 5-man scenario. The fact that you need the light to be able to even damage the mobs or affect them in any way, and then the mobs trying to move away from you with the light is unbelievably annoying. They've also changed and iterated the way the ending creates itself, and that has been particularly frustrating over the weeks to try to relearn what mobs we're going to pull, where you can skip, and what you can do in the dungeon. Don't even get me started on the bosses. Two of the worst bosses ever conceived for a 5-man ever in the game. Over 13 years, I've never seen anything more annoying than these two bosses. Talking, of course, about the last boss especially, but also the second boss in the room. When you get down there, you could feel the fight is immediately going to become a pain. The entire room is empty and all there is the boss in it. And you think, oh, this should be a pretty easy encounter, but if you fight the boss on his turn, you really have a lot of stupid mechanics to deal with, including a disorient every few seconds, an ability that makes you not be able to cast your abilities for 10 seconds if you don't do it properly, and then constant different variants from the actual trash that comes out on the fight as well. It should say a lot that most people do this fight in a way that is a very poor maximization of uptime. You're just sitting there in the corner waiting for the boss and all the ads to funnel in, because dealing with that, all those sets of mechanics constantly, is just way too bad. And then the last boss, of course, has its legacy to behold. You really are in a situation here that I've never been in a 5-man, where you cannot attack the boss for upwards of a minute, and you're just running around in a random pattern, dodging these things that you can barely see, using a light that is barely perfunctory in its use. So easily my least favorite dungeon, but not the worst 5-man Mythic Plus. My least favorite dungeon, number 9 overall, tier 3, number 3, is of course Court of Stars. Should be fairly obvious if anyone has ever watched me do this dungeon. It's a very complicated and annoying set of trash and bosses, but I do it particularly poorly. The number one thing that really gets on my nerves in this dungeon is how the second half of the trash, pretty much all random. We've had it before multiple times where we kill one of the Harbingers or whatever, and they spawn directly on top of where we killed the previous one, and that has caused a lot of wipes that simply we cannot prevent. There's also the weird interactables in the dungeon itself, and I don't think that has a place in Mythic Plus, guys. I really don't. It seems really weird to me, like, you know, oh, like a Pandaren can do this, or a healer can do this, all that stuff. Just don't really like that. I don't feel like that's fun. I don't feel like that makes the challenging atmosphere that you want in a Mythic Plus. But even worse than all of that is the stupid RP event at the end. Now, don't get me twisted here. I really like this dungeon when it's not a timed race, but it is such a bizarre thing to have in a timed dungeon at all, and obviously trivialized by Protection Paladin, which I play pretty regularly as well in some degree to Demon Hunters, but it's just really stupid. I don't like it at all, and if there was one thing that you could be removed from any 5-man, I would certainly say remove this from Mythic Plus dungeons. So that's it for this fun little tier list. Hopefully you guys enjoyed, but as a summary, once again, how I rated these, basically it was just saying, if you see somebody looking to do this, how likely am I to join it? Doesn't mean I never do core and always do Maw, but in between there's some really fun parts of some dungeons and some really unfun parts of others. Hopefully we can have a nice discussion in the comments below. Since it's not relating to actual people playing their characters, should be a lot less bickering, but I would love to see how you guys feel about all 9 of these Mythic Plus dungeons ahead of the Karazhan editions coming later in the year. I figured this would be a good topic to establish now and maybe have a nice active discussion going on about it. So thanks for watching. I'll see you guys in the next video.